Welcome to the 2020 New Testament Challenge. Today we're in Acts chapter 24. Paul has been in 3 different riots. There in Jerusalem, 2 different riots were taking place. In the Sanhedrin, a riot took place between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Every time the Romans protected Paul, they rescued him. And now the Romans have taken him to Caesarea to stand before the governor, Felix. Now, Felix was the governor, and he knew about Paul. And so we're going to be reading what takes place as he's standing before the governor. In verse 1 of chapter 24, we read, 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down from Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. Finally, in verse 5, they said, "We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world." That is not true. All of the riots that Paul was a part of, he didn't start them. He just was the focus of those riots because people were seeing how God was working through Paul and they wanted to get rid of Paul. But then it says also in verse 5, as they're talking before the governor, they said this about Paul, that he is the ringleader of the Nazarene sect. What a great name for a church. Where did that name come from? It came from Matthew chapter 2. Mary and Joseph were coming back home after keeping Jesus safe as a baby. Now they come back home, but they're trying to find a safe place to go. So it says in verse 23 of Matthew chapter 2, "And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what the prophet said, he will be called a Nazarene." Because of that, the church was known as a sect by the Jews, and it was a Nazarene sect. But there was another name that the church was known by as well, and that is known as the Way. Where did that name come from? Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me." So the early church was known as a Nazarene sect or followers of the Way. Paul even said that he was a follower of the Way. In verse 14, Paul was talking to the governor, and he said, "I admit that I worship the God of our fathers, and as a follower of the Way, which they call a sect." But it's interesting to note that as Felix was listening, he knew everything about the Way. He was acquainted with the early church, and he wanted to hear more about it. So he kept Paul a prisoner for 2 years. But this is what it says about Paul's confinement. In verse 23, the governor, he ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. In the past, Paul has been in prison before. He's been in chains. He's been in stocks. He's been in the dungeon. He has been abused. Paul has been in the worst places of all. But now, for 2 years, Paul has freedom. He is confined, but his friends can come and take care of his needs, keep him warm, keep him fed, visit him. He can now continue his ministry to the churches through correspondence. For 2 years, 24 months, Paul is confined, but he now has freedom. God has blessed him with this time to continue to minister and to recuperate. Paul is going to be on his way to Rome in chapter 25. But before that, God knows what Paul needs. He's gone through difficult situations in the past, and now for 2 years, Paul gets to catch his breath, gain his strength back before he goes on his way to Rome and everything that's going to take place in that journey as well. God knows what our needs are as well, and there are different seasons to life. The season that Paul is in now for 2 years is one to regenerate and to recuperate, to get his batteries recharged again, to continue ministering to the church, but only by correspondence. He's confined, but he has freedom. God takes us in different seasons as well. There are seasons to our life, and God is in charge, and he knows what the future is. So whatever we're going through now, this is not the way it's always going to be. God has something yet in store. For some, it's a very difficult time. God understands. For others, it's a time of recuperation. It's a time of rest. Something else is down the road that God is preparing us for. What we need to do, we need to continue to trust the Lord, to rely upon him, to let him be with us in this very moment, rely upon him for direction and for his Spirit to fill us so that we can see and be prepared for what's going to be taking place yet in the future. God took care of Paul, and God will take care of us as well. Thank you for joining the 2020 New Testament Challenge.